All right, so I just finished reading 1776 by David McCullough. I finished reading this yesterday. This is going to be a fun book to talk about because this is actually, I've read this book before, and it's one of the earliest history books that I ever read, or at least that I remember reading. So I read this, I'm pretty sure, when I was in sixth grade. It was definitely early middle school, and this is right about when I was getting absolutely obsessed with history, specifically early American history, as we started taking some of those history and civics type classes in early middle school and things like that. I have this distinct memory of going to Sam's Club with my mom, where we used to shop, and they had a paperback box set of McCullough books. Specifically, it was a trio of presidential books. So it was the John Adams bio, Truman, and Mornings on Horseback. And I believe they also had this book. I'm pretty sure this is where I got it. They had this book for sale just kind of separately. And so she got me this set and this book, and I was just absolutely enamored by it. I read this book just because it was the shortest and it felt the most approachable to me when I was 11, 12, however old I was. And I ended up reading John Adams shortly after this. I mentioned this when I talked about that book last year. I reread that as well after I went to Boston for the first time. I absolutely love that book, and so I wanted to revisit it as well. And so these are the only two books by him that I've read. I still have not read Truman or Mornings on Horseback. I have both on my shelf, but haven't read them yet. And there's a couple others that I want to get to. But similar to John Adams, I wanted to revisit this because I read it when I was quite young. And so I feel like my understanding of history and the context around a lot of these events has grown a lot as I've gotten older and studied more, learned more, read more. And I do think he's a great author, so I think it's good to revisit his works. And I thought it was extremely fitting to read this book in July of 2026 as we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and of course other events that happened throughout that fateful year. It's very cool to be celebrating the 250th anniversary of all that. So I felt like this timing was very fitting. So I love this book, and I feel like when I read it the first time, when I got to the end of it, it was one of those things that, again, I was like 11 years old reading it. It felt honestly incomplete to me because I love the book so much that I wanted it to keep going. So as the title suggests, this really does cover basically just the events of 1776. I'll talk more about it in a little detail because there's some caveats to it. But there's a part of me that wishes that McCullough had just written a book in the same style and just continued it all the way through the Revolutionary War. It probably would be double or triple the size, and he might have to condense some things, but he's just such a good writer and historian of this time that I would have loved it. But regardless, I think reading it again with a fresh eye, it's very easy to see the arc of the story and why he chose to position the book around this year. And I think it does encapsulate the broader Revolutionary War to a certain degree, and I definitely want to talk about that. So to kind of get into it, so the book is only about 300 pages, so I think it's extremely accessible. And again, McCullough is a great writer, and the book flows well. It's not overly dense, like some other history works can be, and it kind of takes a while to get through them. And that's what I love about it. So it doesn't exactly line up quite this neatly, but there are about 300 pages in this book, and there's essentially three different parts or three different sections. The first section essentially covers the and that's what I said, that, the book is the arc is intended to cover the year 1776, but you basically start with some of the events of 1775 when war broke out. He actually opens the book covering King George III having a session in British Parliament talking about the war. He does a good job kind of introducing the conflict, and almost exclusively from a British perspective there. He brings in different viewpoints of different members of Parliament that were either for or against the war, and I think he does a good job of showing kind of both sides of the argument and how things started to play out. Then he goes into the description of war breaking out at Lexington and Concord, the fateful battle at Bunker Hill, and then kind of the stalemate that ensued in Boston. And he basically pushes you through a lot of those events of 75. He gives you a really good introduction to major generals on each side. So for the U.S., of course, George Washington. And then he covers Henry Knox and Nathaniel Greene specifically, because those are the two guys that really are with Washington all the way through from a command perspective. And then, he talks about the Howe brothers on the British side. He talks about Henry Clinton and some other prominent figures. And he does spend a lot of time in this section talking about really discussing really the might of the British Army, especially the Navy, and comparing that to the Continental Army, who's struggling to really just be able to rally troops in these militias, and how they have such shortage of uniforms, munitions, like all kinds of things that they need, and kind of juxtaposing the two, this global superpower of a military versus this kind of ragtag group. And I think he does a good job of explaining why George Washington was like the perfect person to kind of lead the troops through this time. And so it basically takes about 70 pages, the first two chapters, to get you to the events of 1776. And, he talks about how he talks a little bit of, especially with Washington, his background, and his campaign in the French and Indian War that actually went really bad, but how he served in the First Continental Congress from the state of Virginia, which was, of course, so prominent among the original 13 colonies, and how he just kind of became the ideal leader. And he talks about how John Adams is the one who nominates him officially to be the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And so he does a good job of kind of establishing that, pushing us to 1776. And that's what begins this second section. So basically he talks about, again, the extensive stalemate between the British and the Americans, really in Boston, and then Bunker Hill after that battle. And, this leads to the famous kind of surprise attack led by Washington at Dorchester Heights, that really kind of was like a wake-up call for the British, because Washington and his troops really did take them by surprise. And it didn't exactly force, but I think it definitely confirmed that British evacuation of Boston, that eventually, they went to Halifax and then would end up in New York, where most of the events of 1776 will take place. I thought this section was really good, very well described, and I think he did a good job of portraying Washington as someone who, in a lot of these early days, there were not well-defined policies, procedures, guidelines kind of what the commander-in-chief was supposed to be allowed to do or not. So he had a council of war of some of these other generals, and he wanted to surprise attack the British. In a lot of other cases, he wanted to take the fight to them a lot earlier. And McCullough argues this would have probably been disastrous for the Continental Army, and that because he showed restraint and because he listened to other people around him, that's kind of what led to the success of this initial surprise attack. And so I really like that portrait of Washington as being somebody that understood that his initial impulses were not always the best. And again, I think that's a great quality to have in a leader. I think McCullough did a great job kind of analyzing that. He also discussed how after I believe it was after the British fled Boston and were heading to New York, Washington was deciding if he should send troops there ahead of time or not. And he was seeking basically advice and approval from the Continental Congress, specifically the War Committee, which I believe John Adams was the head of at this time. And I thought this was a cool exchange because John Adams was actually back at Braintree, right outside of Boston. And the two of them met up, and John Adams basically gave him, permission to kind of do what he needed to as commander in chief to kind of extend his powers a little bit on behalf of the army, which I thought that was kind of a cool thing. That, again, Washington here, of course, will know when he's president. He does so much to establish and drive all these precedents for the presidency and for the country. I think he does a similar job here, where he establishes it's not all about what he wants to do. He was very intent about listening to other people's opinions, especially that of his fellow generals and or his fellow officers, and then that of the Continental Congress as well. And I think that really in this section and the one prior, McCullough does a good job of giving kind of primary sources of when Washington would write to the Continental Congress and explain, how badly they needed additional troops and additional supplies and munitions and all these other kind of things. And so that basically leads to the second part, when the British arrive in New York, and so does the Continental Army. And this is, I believe the section is called Fateful Summer. It is. And this is really where, for the most part, things do not go well for the Continental Army. There end up being really, really bad defeats at the Battle of Brooklyn, which sometimes is called Long Island, the British capture of Fort Washington, which is probably the worst. And I think McCullough did a great job kind of showing both sides and how there was both good leadership and kind of smart tactics and strategy, and how there was disastrous strategy on the other side as well. It's borderline shocking that at some point in this New York campaign, the British, with all of their naval might, with all of these different rivers and all these different avenues around New York and the surrounding islands, that they couldn't have found a way to cut off the Continental Army and defeat them once and for all. I think there was a lot of, he describes in this section how General Howe and Henry Clinton had differing opinions. So in certain cases, I think it was usually Clinton that would want to go on the attack and pursue the Continental Army. But a lot of times, I think so. Again, it was between Howe and Clinton. I think their opinions kind of depended on which situation it was. But in certain cases, somebody wanted to go on the attack and pursue the Americans. The other wouldn't want to do so for the risk of endangering British lives. Kind of, he described he didn't want like another quote unquote Bunker Hill, where you've got an attacking force going up against an opposing force that's basically like well situated on, a particular elevated piece of land or whatever it is, that's well defended. And it's going to take, even if that advancing force has more arms and more men, it's going to potentially come at a high cost. And I forget which one, but one of them really thought the way to do this was to break the spirit of the Americans with some of these early victories and just hope that they would basically want peace. And so they issued some of these peace overtures, after, and I remember this being described in the John Adams bio, but after, I believe it was the Battle of Brooklyn or Long Island, I think it was Lord Admiral Howe had basically a meeting with Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and there was a third representative from Congress to try to strike a peace treaty that went absolutely nowhere. They also were issuing proclamations just to the public to say, and to soldiers too, that if they defected and came over to the British side, they would be given a pardon, and just really trying to drive a wedge between their representatives and, the citizenry at large. So there was some interesting discussion here. And it really seemed like if the British command had just been able to be on the same page and kind of understanding how dire the situation really was for the Continental Army at times, that they really probably could have potentially defeated the army right then and there. And, whether it was the decision to try to achieve peace versus risking more British lives, whether it was not trying to follow an advancing or a retreating army, but holding back and kind of regrouping. There's a lot of different cases for it, but I think that's just such a fascinating conversation to be had. And, at the very end of this book, in the third section, it really ends with the surprising victories after this had been just a horrible summer and fall, essentially, for the Continental Army, just on basically just this one big long retreat and defeat after defeat. The surprise victories at Trenton and Princeton. Everybody remembers Washington's famous crossing of the Delaware on Christmas Day and leading that surprise attack. And McCullough really drives that was one of the turning points of the war. Usually Saratoga, which happens well after the events of this book, but Saratoga is usually considered the official turning point of the war because that convinces the French to finally openly support the Americans. But he argues that it really was that much needed victory at Trenton and then Princeton that kind of boosted morale and reinstalled confidence in Washington. He describes, the capture of Charles Lee, who really was kind of the second or the only other person that could have at the time had an argument to be the leader of the army. And this kind of not solidified, but it pushed General Washington kind of back up in that highest regard over Charles Lee after his capture. And again, there's more to come with that, of course, with the Horatio Gates's victory at Saratoga leading to something like the Conway Cabal of Gates versus Washington, and then Charles Lee and Washington will, of course, there'll be some kind of more conflict there. But really, he shows this as an example of how Washington was kind of able to rise head and shoulders above the rest. But anyway, all that to say that everybody knows the famous crossing of the Delaware, and it's well covered in this book. But I think the kind of lesser known one is the miraculous retreat across the East River, where again, this is one of those cases that if the Continental Army can't pull off that retreat perfectly, basically it could be a wrap if they were trapped between the river and the other side of the, between New York or Long Island. It basically could have been a wrap at this point because, the British had amassed such a force at Staten Island. As they pushed forward, they really probably could have cut them off at the river. And then again, if they were able to kind of use their naval superiority, there could have been ways to cut off the Americans. And he talks about how some of that is really weather driven and, some of it's kind of dictated by the direction of the wind and if you can flow in a certain, path of the river or not. So I think his description of the East River as borderline miraculous was excellent. So again, those were, I think, kind of the highlights. And then he ends with the victories at Trenton and Princeton and kind of just very briefly discusses how, this foreshadows some of the major issues that, the issues that were shown in 1776 would continue to be an issue throughout the course of the war. But Washington's leadership, even though he wasn't the best tactician in a lot of cases, he was the perfect leader, and he really knew how to orchestrate a strategic escape and retreat when he needed to. And I think McCullough does a good job discussing how an advancing army like the British or an invading force, it's a lot harder to kind of win over that than it is for, a military who's in their home country, who knows the terrain better and basically just has to kind of evade and outlast the invading force. He has good analysis of that. I also wanted to highlight, I love the descriptions of Henry Knox in this book. I thought his, the section that described him going to Fort Ticonderoga to get so many of the large cannons and other artillery pieces, and just the amazing journey back to be able to bring back to Boston, to be able to bring this in kind of these horrible winter conditions, which then really prompted the surprise attack at Dorchester Heights. I thought was just excellent and riveting. One of my favorite sections of this book, and I think again well describes why Henry Knox would become basically an artillery officer. So all that to say, I wanted to read this section on surrounding July 4th. Most of this book is a military history, but he occasionally will break to discuss what Congress was doing or discussing at the time. So I wanted to read this section because I just absolutely loved it. In Philadelphia, the same day as the British landing on Staten Island, July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress, in a momentous decision, voted to dissolve the connection with Great Britain. The news reached New York 4 days later, on July the 6th, and at once spontaneous celebrations broke out. The whole choir of our officers went to a public house to testify our joy at the happy news of independence. We spent the afternoon merrily, recorded Isaac Bangs. A letter to John Hancock to Washington, as well as the complete text of the Declaration, followed 2 days later. That our affairs may take a more favorable turn, Hancock wrote, the Congress may have judged it necessary to dissolve the connection between Great Britain and the American colonies and to declare them free and independent states, as you will perceive by the enclosed declaration, which I am directed to transmit to you, and to request you will have it proclaimed at the head of the army in any way you shall think most proper. Many, like Henry Knox, saw at once with the enemy massing for battle so close at hand and independence at last declared by Congress, the war had entered an entirely new stage. The lines were drawn now as never before, the stakes far higher. The eyes of all America are upon us, Knox wrote. As we play our part, posterity will bless or curse us. By renouncing their allegiance to the king, the delegates at Philadelphia had committed treason and embarked on a course from which there was no turning back. We are in the very midst of a revolution, wrote John Adams, the most complete, unexpected, and remarkable of any in the history of nations. In a ringing preamble, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, the document declared it self-evident that all men are created equal and were endowed with the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to this noble end the delegates had pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Such courage and high ideals were of little consequence, of course, the declaration itself being no more than a declaration without military success against the most formidable force on earth. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, an eminent member of Congress who opposed the declaration, had called it a skiff made of paper, and as Nathaniel Greene had warned, there were never any certainties about the fate of the war. From this point on, the citizen soldiers of Washington's army were no longer to be fighting only for the defense of their country or for their rightful liberties as free-born Englishmen, as they had at Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, and through the long siege at Boston. It was now a proudly proclaimed all-out war for an independent America, a new America, and thus a new day of freedom and equality. At his home in Newport, Nathaniel Greene's mentor, the Reverend Ezra Stiles, wrote in his diary almost in disbelief, "Thus the Congress has tied a Gordian knot, which the Parliament will find they can neither cut nor untie. The 13 united colonies now rise into an independent republic among the kingdoms, states, and empires on earth. And have I lived to see such an important and astonishing revolution?" At a stroke, the Continental Congress had made the glorious cause of America more glorious still, for all the world to know, and also to give every citizen soldier at this critical juncture something still larger and more compelling for which to fight. Washington saw it as a fresh incentive, and to his mind it had come not a moment too soon. On Tuesday, July 9th, at 6 in the evening, on his orders, the several brigades in the city were marched onto the commons and other parade grounds to hear the declaration read aloud. The general hopes this important event will serve as a fresh incentive to every officer and soldier to act with fidelity and courage, the orders read, as knowing that now the peace and safety of his country depends, under God, solely on the success of our arms, and that he is now in the service of a state possessed of sufficient power to reward his merit and advance him to the highest honors of a free country. The formal readings concluded, a great mob of cheering, shouting soldiers and townspeople stormed down Broadway to Bowling Green, where, with ropes and bars, they pulled down the gilded lead statue of George III on his colossal horse. In their fury, the crowd hacked off the sovereign's head, severed the nose, clipped the laurels that wreathed the head, and mounted what remained of the head on a spike outside the tavern. Much of the lead from the rest of the statue would later be, as reported, melted down for bullets to assimilate with the brains of our infatuated adversaries. I just absolutely love that section talking about the Declaration, how at a time when, again, such really, really bad events were about to unfold in New York the summer of '76, this gave such a motivation and a reason for the fight. I thought was excellent. And he goes on to say, how does this raise the spirits of the Continental Army so much? And I just thought that section was so well described, and I thought it was excellent because, yes, we declared independence on July 4th, well, technically the 2nd, but we celebrate declaring independence on July 4th, '76, but that really meant nothing without the heroic efforts of the Continental Army being able to achieve this victory. I also wanted to read that towards the very end, there was kind of some discussion around, this was around the victories of Trenton and Princeton. There was some more discussion kind of around what the powers Washington had to, let me just read it. He actually, some enlistments were due to expire right at the end of the year, which is where this book, towards the end of the book, this is taking place. He offers them without approval from Congress, basically an advance raise. He felt like he needed to do something to keep these men on board. McCullough writes, in the last hours before New Year's Day, Washington would learn that on December 27th, by the vote of Congress, he had been authorized to use every endeavor, including bounties, to prevail upon the troops to stay with the army. Indeed, for a period of 6 months, the Congress at Baltimore had made him a virtual dictator. Happy it is for the country, read part of the letter transmitting the resolution, that the general of their forces can safely be entrusted with the most unlimited power, and neither personal security, liberty, nor property be in the least degree endangered thereby. In his letter of reply to the members of Congress, Washington wrote, instead of thinking myself freed from all civil obligations by this mark of their confidence, I shall constantly bear in mind that as the sword was the last resort for the preservation of our liberties, so it ought to be the first thing laid aside when those liberties are firmly established. I love that description of what Washington was so adequately able to keep in mind, because the debates around a standing army just consumed so much of the early days of our country after the war. And with our modern day viewpoint on this 250 years later, with our crazy military industrial complex, I think this just bears such wisdom from Washington. And I just think that's absolutely worth keeping in mind. And yeah, like I said, the book basically covers the events of 76, but he does cover, the early skirmishes in 75 through the campaign at Princeton, which really goes through like early 1777. So that's where that last little bit covers. And then very lastly, there was just a quote from, I love this quote from Henry Knox, who, again, after things went very poorly and the army started to retreat from New York, Henry Knox said, we want great men who, when fortune frowns, will not be discouraged. I just absolutely love that. And kind of just describing what they saw that they needed in the Continental Army. So I know I've been talking for a while, but I think this book is great. Again, it's got some excellent analysis. I think McCullough has great portrayals of a lot of these key figures, and also uses primary sources to pull in lesser known figures as well to describe the story of 1776. And I just think it's so readable and so entertaining, and I just think it's excellent. So I'm really glad I revisited this, and it's such a fun time reading this, the 250th anniversary of the fateful events of July 76. I give this book 5 stars. Absolutely love it. I think it's fantastic, and I think it just is such a good arc to describe so much of what happens during the American Revolution. So thank you for listening.